say that it feels right.
What's up YouTube, it's the Blender, and today I wanted to talk about why I think Oblivion Remastered, while a fantastic game, I don't think it beats Oblivion Classic, and I don't think it beats Skyrim. With the remastered, the graphics did get updated. This is one of probably the biggest standout awesome piece, right? Or best part of this function, right? And probably generally the main reason it was done, right? Obviously, they probably did it for money, right? But I mean, like, in general, when you are doing a remaster of something, right? It's not like they redesigned all things, right? And adjusted everything and reimagined the game, right? It is more of a reskin, right? In fact, I would argue that had they just left everything alone and reskinned the original game, um, it would be it would probably be better than it currently is, right? So I'm hoping some things are done. I'm hoping it gets some updates that bring it sort of back to or online with on par with the original. Um, but I still don't think I could ever go back to playing with the original after playing this one, because I mean, potato graphics and versus this, a beautiful Oblivion Gate. This looks like the way I remembered these things when I was a kid, right? If I went back and played the original, I would probably get motion sickness or something. Um, Another really good thing is I think that they kept the heart and soul of the game together and intact. They left the story alone. They didn't reimagine it. They didn't adjust it for a modern audience. They didn't do any of the sort of like hot button items that sort of crop up. I haven't found, or at least don't know of, a whole bunch of censoring. Um, it's really just kind of got all of the things that it did before, and for me it's a huge nostalgia trip, right? So like it's a trip back to my the couch as a teenager, right? Playing this on an Xbox, right? And yeah, I'm loving I play on PC now, but I'm loving every minute of it, right? Or have loved every minute of it. I have approximately just under 300 hours on master difficulty alone, and still enjoying it, right? With the exception, like I said, there are some combat functions that I don't particularly appreciate, and I'll get into those later. Skyrim, I think, is also just better at this, right? So I think basically everything that we got, minus the UE5, right? Graphical updates already exists in Skyrim, right? The combat move sets, the different pieces, right? Like so, like generally the combat move sets, right? But the collisions that you get with enemies, um, other than UE5 probably giving them more particles and having them be a little better at collision mechanics, right? This stuff already happened in Skyrim, right? So it makes me feel a little bit more like this stuff wasn't necessarily developed for Oblivion Remastered as much it was just adapted to Oblivion Remastered but pulled from Skyrim, right? And like for example, the weapon attack speed, right? They did a bunch of changes to weapon attack speeds, but really I don't know how much weapon attack speeds changed as much as, all right, they feel like the weapon attack speeds from Skyrim. If you go into Skyrim and you go grab a base, right, a base level two-hander, right, it feels about as slow as it does in Oblivion Remastered, right? I even tried the regular attack and then power charge it, or hold the button down while that's happening to do a power attack in the second one. The animations finish a little faster, right? So you don't get like an animation cut um, at all in this game, but it still works. In fact, that's how I generally run these combos, even with the one-hander, right? I click once, right? That does the first attack, and then I click the second one and hold it, and it does a second regular attack, and then it realizes that I'm also holding it, so then it does a power attack follow-up, and I just repeat that, right? I can just click once and then click and hold, click once and then click and hold, and I do 3 attacks in faster succession. Now I'm not canceling it with the menu, which you can also do, but it really feels more almost like the combat systems were ported from Skyrim rather than reinvented, reimagined, or implemented in Oblivion and in Oblivion's function. Um, so I think Skyrim wins just kind of like in being a part of that. But the other part there is like I think the damage on power attacks is about equal, etc., etc. The combat move sets are about equal, but in Skyrim you did get like power attacks, like you could dual wield, and then you had a specialty version of a power attack, right? The power attacks in this game don't really sort of like match up to that. Um, and so I'm not entirely sure that I think I prefer the power attack functions out of Skyrim, right? Or at the very least, the ones that are from Skyrim, or that exist here, came from Skyrim. So the other place I think that Skyrim really takes off is dragons, right? So dragons are sort of like a boss enemy, right? They're generally higher, higher level or higher health, right? And you sort of like as you get stronger, obviously, you probably murk them out of existence, right? But they presented a world challenge that sort of like happened, and you got to sort of like test it, and it was kind of like you had to kill one in order to get your shouts. So it's sort of like created this small barrier, or I guess a dragon's pretty large, but a barrier that you had to sort of like overcome in order to acquire your shouts, in order to move forward with your build or your character, right? And that doesn't sort of like exist in this game, all right? If they were going to reimagine something, right, I would have loved to see something like a minute a minor lord, right, or something like that, some sort of like demon that actually is like in the tower or guards the sigil stone, right? Rather than having 3 enemies just gonna be up there that are the same enemies you just cut through, right? I would have loved to see like mini bosses at the top of every tower, right, and randomized for different functions, right? That would have been fun, right? Like, and that would probably be the equivalent, I think, to dragons implemented into this game, right? And I think that would have been, a blast, right? Obviously, they weren't going to do a lot, but yeah, I mean, if it's a remaster and you are reimagining things, I think, and you wanted to put it like sort of on par with, um, no, not active. Yeah, I guess it's more activity, like just activities for the uh, player to experience. I think that would have been a good function, right? And then lastly, I think shouts. The shouts in Skyrim are you still have stones. You still have like you basically have Lord Stone and all the other different stones, right? That equalize out, right, against the stones that you have in Oblivion. I don't find the stones in Oblivion to be, in fact, I find them less impactful to the character than the stones in Skyrim, right? So I think Skyrim did some really good stuff with like passive buffs from stones and passive things for making your character function differently, but not necessarily specifically always being an activatable function, right? And then the shouts themselves are the activatables, but they're significantly more frequent, right? So you can shout before every fight or during every fight, right? You will have a cooldown maybe, right? So maybe it's every other fight if you're getting into a lot of combat, right? Or maybe it's, maybe it's every mob. Maybe it's not every mob, right? Depends on which shouts you use, what functionalities you use. But overall, they all generally sit in this combat functionality window, right? Or pocket, basket that I bucket is what I'll call it, right? And you don't have that here, right? In this game, you have base stats, you have raw stats, right? And then your stones give you temporary things that are lesser or major powers, right? Or lesser or greater powers, right? And they basically, you can, lesser powers I think you can do as long as you pay the cost. So I think lesser powers are probably on par with shouts and good, or could be good, but there's not many that I use, right? And the stones don't provide any, like heaven stones, doom stones, etc. They don't generally provide any permanent buffs, right? That are permanently on your character, right? That help you out. They just give you an activatable that you can use once a day, right? And I don't think once a day abilities are a good system. I think they're great to have like one or two of them, right? And I think attaching them to your class is a really, really good place to do that. Maybe attaching them to you, maybe you change and don't do that to a class, and just give class different passives, right? And then you attach it to a different stone and make that compete. Then you, with the other stones, you have a bunch of different ways to sort of like implement those things, um, that would allow you to do that. But like I feel like my character acquires a once a day ability from his character, a once a day ability from the stone, maybe a once a day ability from a specific quest or something like that, right? And he gets all these things that are situationally useful that I just basically never use, right? Because um, like I'm generally either getting ripped apart and it wouldn't help, or I'm trouncing things like I'm doing here, right? Like running into three of these guys, right? And I just don't care, right? So like the power level, right? There's no lesser or minor that's going to get me through this any faster, right? So I think whereas with Skyrim, if I were to do the same thing and I'm playing an orc and I use Berserk Rage, I'm literally going to get through this at double the speed, right? So I think, or if you're playing a red guard, um, maybe there's some issues with the red guard ability, right? But all of a sudden, like you can spam all your stuff, right? That would be right. So that gets you through more things. You don't have to do the two heals that I just did to that also restore my stamina, right? Or you don't have to cast those spells. So that would be, those are combat functions that sort of makes sense as a once a day thing. Um, Oblivion Remastered things that are also good. I think the simplified leveling, right? So in the previous game, it was really more complex. It wasn't super complex, but it was less intuitive, I would say. And to somebody like who was new or something like that, like a new player or somebody who didn't know those things, those underlying systems, you would typically level, right? So you'd go about the world, you'd experience the things. Maybe you picked up a bow. Maybe you're playing a warrior and you picked up a bow, right? So you're pulling things or you're shooting things with a bow until they get in close, and then you're smacking them, and you're just kind of like playing it naturally, all right? But if you're doing that, you're really leveling and inefficiently and causing yourself to, not get the endurance or not get the specific combat attributes, all right? Because you haven't leveled the skills attached to those attributes, right? And then your character doesn't get as much character power because he's basically putting, like, the world is leveling based off of every time he puts in stats for a level up, but you're not getting the combat stats that you need, right? And having those restricted to three specific stats, you could potentially, you could get up to 12, but what if you only put in 8? What if every level up you only put in 8 of the 12 virtues, right? You would just scale way less than the world would, right? And your character would be weaker, right? And that's sort of where the difficulty, or I would call it artificial difficulty, came from in Oblivion Classic, right? So I think simplifying the leveling makes sense, right? you could potentially argue that you want one of those more complex leveling systems, right? In the like a master mode, maybe that would be something that would change for master mode or legendary mode if they ever put one in. Um, but I don't think that I think the new system is significantly more intuitive and a lot more new user friendly, like new person friendly. And I think it gives the character or the person, the player, more agency over his character and what stats he's using and how his character builds. Right? I like that, you're not it's not sitting here going, "Oh, you didn't get enough blunt skill, so you can't level your strength." Right? I like the fact that, like if I need carry weight and I have an issue with my character, right? I can solve it on the next level up with the stat that I need, right? Rather than having to figure out what skill is attached to what attribute and then level that attribute or level that skill, maybe pay for leveling in that skill specifically, and then level that attribute accordingly, right? So I think the new simplified leveling is a good thing. All right, the movesets being transported in from Skyrim, I think, are a good thing. I like that, especially since they don't feel janky, which I think is a part of the UE5 portion, right? Because like I don't think the original engine would ever be able to do those things. Um, and then the better magic leveling, or magic skills leveling based off of magic cost, right? Magnitude of magic cost, basically, right? On a percentage base. I think that is a fantastic update. I hated leveling things like restoration, and I hated like leveling destruction, right? So like in the old game, leveling destruction really, or any spell really felt like you had to get to the arcane tower, you had to get to Frostcrag, or you had to get to the Mages Guild opened up so that you could get to custom spells, so that you could craft a spell that, only cost you nothing and spam it, right? And then you would just hold down a macro or you'd spam that ability, and that was how you had basically like if you wanted 100 restoration, that was just how you were going to do it, right? Because like doing it naturally was just almost an impossibility. So I like that it's more feasible, and I like that it feels more feasible. And I think for like even for destruction, right? Like or any combat stuff, minus conjuration, because conjuration ignores difficulty, right? But any of the combat things, right? Like even illusion, right? If you were doing the old system, your character would level from all the other things, whether it be sneak or security or any other functions, right? And or like mercantile from selling things, right? It would start to level and gain experience based off of those things, while your illusion spells or your combat spells didn't get enough hits in, right, to actually level, which created this scenario where not only were you probably like if you were new, right, or you were doing this sort of like as you went, right, on a first playthrough, you were probably not putting your stats in efficiently and where you needed to, right? So you were going to be lower on health, you were going to be lower on combat potential, right? And then the world was going to level up, but it was also harder to level those skills, so they weren't going to be as combat effective when you used them, right? And so you got this sort of like double chain of like it's not super efficient. Um, and I think they've managed to fix those. Um, the only problem I have there is that they didn't apply that same logic to, or similar logic to, physical damage, right? And combat skills. So it works great, and I think it's actually in a really good spot for magic. But physical skills and combat skills have really suffered because of some of the changes, right, with attack speed and how and the amount of experience they get per level, along with major minor skills, right? They've really gone to a place where it's significantly tougher to level the combat skills in the remaster than it was in the original, and it was already painful in the original. So I think that your physical builds now basically have the classic experience, right, for length of time of getting to like a decent power level or to a level of power, and leveling a character if you were focusing on those things. Meanwhile, the magic just sort of gets the cream of the crop, right? So um, I don't really care that it's unfair. I simply care that it seems almost unusable, right? So like if you've been watching the background, this is my character. He's an entirely melee. He basically used sword and board. Eventually, I got a two-hander. He has 50 destruction, and I only leveled that later or after I was already basically done with gates and everything, so that I could test around with like making a two-hander work and whether or not I needed to scale it with destruction enchants on the weapon, etc., etc. But like all of these fights take a little bit, right? And he's able to stand in there only because he has a stupid amount of defense, right? And that's why he's able to make, melee work. It's not because he does a lot of damage, right? If you see a melee character in this game doing a lot of damage, it is more than likely because he's gone and used enchants. He's basically just a mage, the just applicator of those enchants or the spell is his weapon rather than his hands, and that's just, to me, that's not a really great feeling, right? I like my character to be able to stand up on its own 2 feet when it's doing its thing. Now, granted, it is master difficulty and it is still functionally doing its function. It's not stacking weakness, right? So it's not like master difficulty is not viable, or you can't make a melee build, or you can't make a physical damage build on master difficulty, because clearly you can, right? This guy's level 29. Yeah, he's 29, almost 30, right? And he does just fine, right? It does mean that you have to dance in and out, and fights are gonna take longer, but and you're not gonna get this super powerful. You're never gonna feel super powerful, right? Everything's gonna be, get in, do your damage, get out, right? The most powerful you'll feel is when you can walk in and just stand in front of things and beat them up. But you aren't beating them up very fast. You're gonna smack them. Even I think partway through this, I end up using Umbra, which is basically the damage of a two-hander, and it's still it's still nuts how much longer it takes without an enchant, right? Like even the weapon he uses right now is Goldbrand, which has 22 fire damage on it. Right? Just adding the 22 fire damage makes a world of difference. And when the enchant's out, you really feel it. All right? So most of the damage probably being done isn't from the 30 if it's armored, if it's increased with armor by, the 150%, it's got a 30 base damage. If I'm running around with 30 base damage, that's 5 damage overall, right? On master, right? So like that's a flat 5 damage. If I add 22 fire damage to it, I'm adding 3, almost 4 damage just in fire on that enchant, right? It's a 60% increase, give or take. All right, that's pretty solid, right? That's insane. If I'm able to weakness stack, like if I weakness stack one time, it's 100% increase, right? If you start doing weakness stacking on top of that, like on your uh, weapon or through abilities, you just scale way faster, much better, right? And I think that's the big problem, is that it sort of leads into the physical damage fatigue was removed from the damage formula, which I understand, right? There were some ways to sort of like cheese it and get into, you could basically drain your agility and maybe willpower or whatever it was, right? And you could basically set your fatigue down to 1, right? And then fortify it, right? So you got your maximum fatigue was 1, and then it was fortified way above that. So you got this huge percentage damage increase to your ability, your physical abilities, right? And then you went around breaking the game. But again, we left a bunch of different like bugs in the game. We left weakness stacking for magic in the game. It doesn't make sense why we had to remove stamina or in this case fatigue from the physical damage formula and not replace it with something, right? If you had replaced it, if you had replaced it with the blacksmithing from Skyrim, right? To where not only did I have to repair or could I repair stuff, but I could improve my weapon with a repair hammer, and by improving it, it would permanently increase its damage, right? By an amount, and then I had smithing enchants or something like that that made me better at smithing, so that it would improve farther, right? To where I could make one of these swords do 100 damage like I can an elven sword in Skyrim. Then the scaling sort of makes sense, because then the scaling is in your ability to improve or craft and improve your gear in a physical manner such that you can sort of maintain with the scaling of the world, right? That would sort of make sense, right? Or you just put scaling back in, right? Whether it's based off stamina, maybe it's based off of your skill, right? Maybe it has a the first 100 points have an amount, right? And then you get diminished returns from the next 100 points, and then you get an additional diminishing returns from the next 100 points, et cetera, right? You can sort of limit the scaling of these things, but removing it entirely, leaving magic, leaving magic the way it was, and then uh, giving physical combat basically nothing. It just sucks, right? It doesn't feel good, and it makes every fight into a slog, and it makes it so that you literally never get the power fantasy. Um, the next thing that I really don't like that they brought over was the resource generation is reduced in combat, in addition to the resource generation is completely stunted or stopped for like 2 seconds, right? After you have used one of that resource, right? So if you cast a spell, you have to wait a couple seconds before regen starts on that spell, right? And then if you cast or if you swing a weapon and use your fatigue, right, then you have to wait several seconds before regen starts on those. Now, I don't think that either one of these systems is a terrible function, right? But I think the two of them combined don't make sense in this game. I think they don't make sense really in Skyrim, and I think the reason for that is because they have basically just become mechanics in the game that you have to solve, right? Um, like you basically just solve that in order to play the character. That's basically like what the early game of Legendary Skyrim looks like, right? Just you either running around doing something, right, whatever that might be, and solving the problem at hand of your resource generation or resource consumption, right? And once resource consumption, resource generation is figured out, then you can play your character, right? And so bringing those systems over into Oblivion makes it so that one Oblivion's already a bit rougher in scaling and function than Legendary Skyrim is anyway. But putting those systems in just basically means we have to solve for more things, right? And with the scaling of master difficulty or scaling of the even expert difficulty and master difficulty in this game, right? I think I don't talk about Adept because I think it's a joke, and at least it's story mode, right? And I think it's great for people who, like my cousin is a guy who enjoys the backstory of games, and he loves to experience the game, and he gets that power fantasy out of that, right? And he gets to go explore the world, and he doesn't really care about the function underneath and how it affects him as long as his character does good, right? And he's having a blast with it, right? Um, but that's he's not gonna put it on the higher difficulty, right? He's here to experience that function or that story, not to be good at it, not to beat a challenge, right? He just wants to experience the game, all right? Which is a completely valid way to play, and if that's what you like to do, that's what you like to do. Absolutely. But if you look at my channel, right, like the things I have posted, right, I did our legendary Skyrim runs, or um, 10 or 20-second um, Atom Smasher kill in Cyberpunk on very hard, right? Like, I like to, and Don't Fear the Reaper in 6 minutes, right? I like to take the game, put it to its max difficulty, and then find a way to beat it, right? And then find a way to beat it optimally or efficiently, and be able to um, do that, right? That's sort of where I derive my enjoyment. So when I take this game and I have, master difficulty is, six times and six division, right? 6 times for their damage and six division for yours, um, and that which is significantly a larger spread than legendary Skyrim. And then they also bring in the mechanics from Skyrim that you typically solve before you're actually able to play your character. It just sort of feels bad, right? And then if you combine that with the nerfs to the different damage functions, right? Like it just feels bad. The shield blocking, right? Not be you in original you were or in classic you were able to shield block and cast spells, right? Now I understand that I sort of understand that since they buffed block to be able to block 100% of the damage, right? If you've got 100 block skill, you can block 100% of incoming damage. Because that exists, it sort of makes sense as to why you would force people to pull the block down in order to cast a spell, right? So you have this like window of vulnerability. Um, but I kind of liked the old function, right? And maybe that's just me being greedy, right? But block wasn't as overpowered, right? It wasn't as efficient at blocking damage, right? It was literally like if you block, you can only maximum block like 75% of incoming damage there, right? So you could never block the whole amount, right? So if you just sat behind your shield and cast your spell, you had to sort of manage like the utilization of your mana versus your health pool, right? Because they were gonna hit you. You were gonna take damage. So I understand the block thing. I like the change, kind of, right? I think block is a little weird with like when it does block and when it doesn't. Um, but it is a good function, and I don't like that it does do 100%, right? Because it sort of trivializes the things, but at the same time, you could sort of use it as the idea that um, it's designed to allow tanks to be super tanky, and it allows like battle mages to use just a weapon and their like a spell sword. They can use a weapon and their spell in the other hand, so they don't use a shield, right? And if they are blocking, they're blocking with the sword, right? And then or the weapon, which then means that they're not blocking 100% of the damage. So there are some arguments that can be made to sort of like justify it, but I do think it does get a little bit overpowered. 90% would have been fine instead of 100, right? But I mean, it is what it is, right? And that one I'm not super fussed over. Um, like unlike the resource gen, right? The resource generation stuff is just um, annoying, right? And it doesn't make sense for the combat style, right? Like it really forces the combat into a much slower, almost Dark Souls like experience, which we don't get lock on. So like why would we want this to be Dark Souls? And then lastly is some of the bugs that exist in the game for combat, um, like how did archery make it to being able to paralyze somebody, right? Which I think is actually a really good perk, right? Blunt weapons probably need more defense out of their thing and probably some extra functions, maybe some reordering of things to sort of like make them make sense. Blade I think is okay. I think the weakness stack or weakness needs to be like 100%, so think it needs to be more impactful, like a 50%, 100%. Um, but archery gets to paralyze, right? Which from long distance, paralyzing your foe, being able to get two or three shots in while they're paralyzed, it's fantastic, right? And I think it thematically works good, and I think it just like combat wise actually fits decently, especially with the changes to like how much damage they do. But the paralyze causing the crash, if you shoot the paralyzed enemy, basically means that when I'm playing an archer, every time I shoot, right, and I see the little green swirl come up, which means that man's paralyzed, I'd better hit the quick save button, right? And when I hit that quick save button, it's possible the game could crash because I've quick saved too many times. It's possible the game could crash because there's some other weird crashes that are possible through load files and like the game running too long and some other things, right? It's also possible that the shot that I just took, right, could just crash the game because the character that I hit was paralyzed specifically by my archery skill, and for whatever reason that causes a crash. So, like, I don't understand how that gets to uh, production, right? Unless the production team or the QA team, if there is one, never tested the archery function, right? Never tested it at, 80, 90 archery or 100 archery, right? Like I only have 90 archery on my archer character, right? If I get to 100 and the chance to paralyze doubles, that means my chance to crash doubles, right? If they tested it at 100, they should have known that that's a thing, right? And got that fixed before it shipped. It doesn't make any sense, right? So, and I know there are other sort of like weird things, like, and this is why I think that things were sort of like ported from Skyrim, because paralyzing on hit is also the level 100 perk for archery in Skyrim. Um, but in Skyrim, because you have kill cams, the paralyze effect would sometimes drop the enemy into the paralysis, and they would fall to the ground before if you were far enough away, it would do that, but it was calculated on the release of the arrow, so the enemy would fall to the ground, and then the arrow would go by, and then the enemy would never get hit by the arrow, never take the damage, and stand back up like nothing happened, right? So they clearly have a problem with paralyzed functionality in their game and how they code it. Um, so I don't know why, when it already had problems in Oblivion or in Skyrim, that it was brought to Oblivion, and then it has a completely new issue entirely. So there are some of those weird bugs, right, and stuff like that, that could potentially just make like certain characters or certain builds just unplayable, and so it sort of makes me worried about what that looks like, right? Because if like it is a Bethesda game, we all have the meme, right? Like it's a Bethesda game, it's gonna have bugs, um, but like it makes me sort of worried about what Elder Scrolls 6 might look like in those sorts of senses, right? And like, is there a QA team, or are we gonna run it through a beta of a whole bunch of people, right? A closed beta or an open beta, right? Or maybe an early access for some weird reason, right? And then not listen to the community and not listen to fixes and right and have the bugs show up anyway, right? That sort of scares me. And then like the fact that this game feels more like it was reskinned with UE5 while being slapped on with combat functionality from Skyrim, right, to make it feel more updated, right? And just sort of almost it's not phoned in, right, like Starfield, right? But it doesn't necessarily feel like it was really a priority piece, right? And really given the time that it should have. Why the things that I don't like are bad, I think I sort of covered most of this with like I don't like the for example with the resource thing, right? Like the resource being stunted and also being reduced, right? And the two of them combining together to make this really terrible experience, right? Even by themselves, I don't think they're fantastic, right? I don't mind them by themselves because they just sort of like create this delay, which like sort of creates a pattern in which you have to play, and if you don't like that pattern, or yeah, if you don't like that pattern, then you find a way to solve that, right? But it's not mandatory. Um, in order for the character to function or for you to work that. Whereas when they're both there, I think that they basically force you into solving them first. Um, but I don't like mechanics that are put into the game that are basically don't enhance the gameplay. They don't enhance your character. They don't make the combat more intuitive, right? They literally don't do anything but prevent me from being able to use my character for a period of time, right? Or prevent me from being able to use the thing that I want to do for a period of time if I don't have that resource, right? And having to wait, right? So like in master difficulty, um, every fight becomes a run out, like even if you're blocking, right? So like even if you're early game and you're going, okay, I do two attacks and then I block, right? Well, if you're doing two attacks and then blocking, you're going to run out of stamina a lot faster than if you do one attack while blocking. The enemy will die faster, but so will your stamina bar, right? So like if you can't kite that enemy while your stamina bar regens, right? Or take the zero fatigue block that'll then give you like 50% of your stamina back. If you if you can't take the hit that you're gonna when he staggers you, um, and you can't kite him, then you can't afford to kill him faster. You need to be able to block and run away during the block and do some resets, right? And it just sort of becomes this really long, drawn out fight, all because we put in these mechanics that just prevent us from being able to, um, regenerate these resources and be able to use our damaging abilities. Um, so I think those are just basically mechanics that are put in the game to slow down the player, and because of it, it's not a fun gameplay loop, and the player just solves those things before they're able to actually play the character the way they want. And so I think those are um, I would call them poor game design. I don't like them in Skyrim. I don't like them here. And I think that there are just better ways to do it, right? I think even if you had just you could leave resource gen and then cap willpower, right? Like there are a bunch of ways to change how that functions and make it so that they can't just make it useless, right? Or make everything useless, right? And just run a million regen and just spam everything. But it is a single player game and they're doing that anyway, so who knows, right? What the right call is, right? But for me, these sort of systems, they just don't make sense. And then the changes that they did, right, to things like stamina stacking, right, with the fatigue changes against the physical damage, right? The changes that they did, even to some of the signs, right, like the birth signs, fundamentally changed the racial bonuses for characters, right? And those weren't addressed, right? So it's almost like this change for fatigue, right, came in at the last minute just before it was shipped, right? Like it's like they were still doing physical damage things or trying to figure out physical damage when they shipped the game, right? As far as I understand it, the uh, fatigue change or the reach change was way later in the process, right? Like, and pushed early or before, real soon to, real close to the release. So if we if I look at that and I go, okay, well, the stamina thing feels not good. The Archer thing, paralyzed, feels untested, and you know, there's no scaling adjustment. There was nothing put in to allow physical damage to scale, right? After taking scaling away, and then reach and attack speed were removed or changed later, right? Towards the release. This just says, we weren't quite sure how we want physical damage to function, and we basically threw in a whole bunch of Skyrim stuff, and we didn't get the time to develop it in the way we wanted it for Oblivion, so we just made it like Skyrim, right? And gave it none of, but we don't have all the systems of Skyrim, so we don't get to, it doesn't get the scalability that Skyrim has, right? So when you do that, it also changes how those things work. Like if you run a um, orc, for example, right? The character gets his berserk ability. Now in classic, his berserk ability gave him 50 strength, and strength was more important for the damage, right? But also gave him 200 fatigue, right? Which basically, if for easy math, right? If that's a 200% multiplier, because you have, let's say at level 1 you have 100 fatigue, right? And you get an extra 200, and it's a 1% per fatigue, right? That's a 200% increase, right? Well, now you get to hit basically at a 3 times as hard as normal, or yeah, it's a 3x multiplier for that, right? During that time period. And it came at the cost of the agility, which means you don't get to jump as high, you don't get to do those things, and it's not good for bows, right? So it was a melee focused, right, or strength focused, yeah, strength focused, um, physical ability that allowed you to really wreck shop, right? It gave you damage increase, right? Similar to the way it does in Skyrim, right? Berserk is actually good in Skyrim. And then the stamina or fatigue change basically made that null and void, and so now, right, there's literally only one race that is optimal to play, or proper to play, if you will, in master difficulty, right? Obviously, if you're playing adept, anything works, and if you're an expert, you can probably make most anything work, right? And if you're playing on master difficulty, you can make anything work, but it means that you are forced to solve, like if you're using a race that's not Breton, you are forcing yourself to solve issues that you wouldn't normally have to solve, right? And with basically no upsides, right? There, like there's basically no upside to running the apprentice, right? You should just run the Althmer, right? Instead, right? But if you do that, you gain susceptibility to magic, and you lose the resistance, which means you have to get higher to or higher amount of resistance to become immune, and then you also make it so that your um, character doesn't have the natural resistance, so you have to get more out of that just in general, and so you just end up in this weird thing where um, if you're not going Breton Lord or Breton Mage, right, you're just handicapping yourself. None of the other classes have anything comparable to it, right, that make them viable in these scenarios. And that just sort of feels bad, right? And like Orc at least had a chance, right, with the fatigue. Redguard potentially had a chance with its, fortifies and whatnot, right? And in fact, Redguard I think has the better ability, um, than Orc, right? As an all-around piece, but doesn't have the magic resist, right? And the magic resist on the Orc is actually, is the only thing that really sort of made it comparable to be able to like the two in combo, right? Berserk plus the the innate magic resist is what made it able to sort of like be on par with Breton or be able to function sort of in similar space with it, right? And now that it can't give you any extra damage in any way, shape, or form, it just falls off entirely. So those sorts of things, right? Like with when you change something about the original game, right? Which I think is good to look at them, and if they don't function the way you want to, then change them. Um, but when you do those things and then you don't adjust the, myriad of things that are, going to be affected by that change, it just sort of feels either rushed or like you just didn't care about that particular part of the aspect of the game, right? Which sort of gives this scenario where it almost feels like a council of mages made the remaster, and the melee guys or tanks and warriors just got destroyed, right? And Rangers got forgot about until until the end, where they went, oh yeah, by the way, you exist, right? We'll give you the same perks we gave you in the last game. Oh, and by the way, they're still gonna break and not work, right? And break your game. So while I think this video is probably more negative than it is positive, but while I think that the game has some improvements, I really hope that at some point they do make some changes and sort of fix these scalability issues, because that will help just everybody's experience across all difficulties, not just the master difficulty guys. And then I am positive about the game. I am cute, and where it's at, right? Like I said, I'm never gonna probably be able to play potato graphics, even if I like the underlying systems again, or better. Um, so I'm stuck here if I want to play Oblivion, and when I'm harsh or critical like this on a game, it's not because I think it's just bad and I want to shit on them, right? Like I want this game to be good, right? Like I think that there are some things that could be changed that would make it really stand the test of time. Like if you wanted, a second Skyrim, a second game that's going to hold people's attention for, 20 years or something like that, right? Then I think there are some fundamental things that you have to make it better than Skyrim. You can't just make it Skyrim in the other, right? Now, maybe they made their money. Maybe it was just for, being able to reskin and let people play, an old game that they'd never experienced on a new set of graphics or an updated set of graphics, right? And that lined the pocketbooks a little bit so that we can continue working on Elder Scrolls 6, or we show a positive number on our balance sheet, right, to Microsoft so that we can keep projects going. Sure, maybe that's what happened. Um, but yeah, so like I want the game to be good. I want Elder Scrolls to be 6 to be absolutely fantastic, and I hope to see some improvements. And I hope that balance it becomes a little bit more of a focus, because right now, at least, in Skyrim, you actually have some pretty good balance where basically everything. I mean, you have not good balance just in the game, right? In general, but you have really good balance between different things, right? Like I can make a two-hander work, I can make an archery build work, right? I can make a dual wield work, I can make a tank work, right? Like there are a million different builds that can all work because you have the tools to be able to scale those things however you want. Um, Whereas in this one, basically, in Oblivion Remastered, you're basically pigeonholed into either doing some sort of game-breaking bug or game-breaking function, right? Some of them are bugs, right? So like maybe you're running Atronach with the telekinesis bug, right? In order to have basically infinite magicka and then being able to do your thing, right? Maybe that's what you're doing, right? Or maybe you're running around at 100% chameleon, so you can't be seen, right? That is not a bug. It's just cheesy, and if you like being invisible and popping things from there, with nobody to fight back, right? More power to you. But to me, that's just really boring gameplay. Um, you you could do uh, archery. Archery, I think you can do really probably just chameleon. I think it's viable, but like I got to 18 or 19. I've got 90 marksman, and I just can't continue to play it with the paralyzed problems, right? So crashing my system all the time, or crashing my game all the time. Um, so you could probably make that work, right? Like that might function, right? But in the end, everything just basically becomes, right. Either you're doing these things to survive or function on master mode, right? Um, or you're going destruction, you're getting weakness stacking, and you're a mage, right? And whether that means that you're putting it on your sword and refilling the charges on your sword all the time, or your melee weapon all the time, or maybe your bow all the time, right? Maybe you're doing a bow instead, right? But you're literally just that. You are nothing more than a mage who is choosing the applicator of which you are going to put your spells on, right? It's going to be the same. Like if you're playing pure mage, you're going to just use the mage, right? You're going to use your hands or on target, right? You're going to craft the spell and you're gonna make it and it's going to work, right? If you are melee, you're going to throw the melee on there, right? The only way you don't do that, right, is if you're not taking it to 40, you're just looking to get to 20, or if 20 or 30 for end game, right? And you're willing to make him tanky as all hell and sit in fights for forever, right? For long times, right? Now these fights aren't terrible, but like even with the enchanted sword, I had a mob in the Shivering Isles that I think absorbed some of like the damage output that I was doing, like some of like even if I like paralyzed them or something, right? And they, because they were absorbing that, they were also absorbing the enchant off of the weapon, and so they didn't get the weakness stack all the time to stack up, right? And if they ran me out of charges and they were all humanoid enemies, right? And so I couldn't recharge the damn thing. Um, I would I would just have to basically reload. So every time I saw that enemy type, I would just have to fight it and pray that it happened in the sequence that allowed me to drop them, or I'd run out of charges on the weapon and have to reload and try again. So all of this ends up just sort of explaining why I think that Oblivion Remastered sort of misses the mark on power fantasy, right? Obviously, Oblivion had some problems, right? And I think Oblivion really sort of missed those marks as well without, some sort of like game breaking mechanic, right? And that's really something that they got more right in Skyrim, where you might start off early and feel terrible, right, or feel bad, but by the end you can snap a shout a dragon out of the sky and smash his face in. All right. The power fantasy really gets fulfilled there. So I think that in Oblivion, that's not there unless you are doing some sort of broken mechanic, whether that's 100% chameleon, weakness ramping, whether that's through spells or doing it with a weapon and an enchant, right? Um, if you're not doing that, it seems like you don't ever really hit that power fantasy, and it sort of like turns into a slog at the end game, which I think is the exact opposite of how that's supposed to work, right? It's supposed to be difficult in the beginning. It's supposed to be you figuring out those different pieces of your build and putting that all together and making that function properly, right? And then when it finally all comes together, you're supposed to feel powerful. You're supposed to be able to smack things around, right? And it doesn't need to be crazy, right? But like, what if I came up to a storm atronach and I hit it 5 times and it died, right? Which ironically I can't do here, but if I had the my proper enchant on as for a weakness stacking, it would take 5 hits and he would be dead, right? Regardless of whether or not he's immune to lightning damage that is also on the weapon, etc. It would still hit him. It would still do damage to him, right? So I think that's one of the oversights of the game. I think it's something that could have been addressed. I think the stamina change or fatigue change to physical really just sort of exacerbated that issue, specifically for physical damage characters. And I hope that in the end, these things are, you know, at the very least addressed for Elder Scrolls 6, and really sort of like focused on, because like if Elder Scrolls 6 is the the next one, and I can't say that Bethesda has a whole lot of what I would call goodwill with its customers, right, this is kind of like the first goodwill piece, right? And um, I think it did a lot for them, but it does feel like 300 hours later, it does feel a little lazy, right? Like not like it was phoned in, right? Like I said before, right? Not phoned in like the Star Rocks game, right? But more like rather than developing and really digging in and understanding the game and what its deficiencies were and whatnot, right? We just reskinned it with UE5 and threw in some Skyrim stuff, right? And so that it would be more, combat, more fluid, and then yeah, just shipped it out, right? Whether it was tested or not. So that's the whole rant. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you share or don't. And if you have any sort of things that if you have a build that you're trying to do that doesn't sort of make sense, or it isn't working properly, or isn't working the way you want it, and it's like some sort of like theme build or whatnot, by all means leave a comment, and I'm happy to you know help out if I can, or even do like runs of different builds, and getting them to like sort of like in viable states. So by all means leave those comments, and if not, you guys have a good one. Thanks.